So hi, welcome to Anchor Reviews. This is Tyler from Anchor Reviews.
And Steven Lawson, aka The Big Steve, on YouTube and Instagram.
So this is basically about my new book called Disney's Live Action Movie Bombs, 1979-2019. Anyway, check it out and enjoy. And also check out my other book, 100 Years of Universal Monster Movies, that is most certainly available right now in hardcover print and digital. Now, the thing is that I originally liked the Universal Monster book. I was going to have a segment of my personal thoughts on these movies. However, I didn't have enough space to include them, so I'm just going to make this video to promote the book and also to give my personal thoughts on these movies. And of course, Steven's going to chime in from time to time about them. I'm going to rank them from an A to an F scale. Now, keep in mind, I'm going to kind of repeat myself with some of these movies because a lot of them are painfully mid, in my opinion. There's only a select few that I either have a strong like or a strong dislike for. But anyway, we'll just agree to disagree if you like these movies a lot more than I did or not so much. But anyway, I'm just going to get to it pretty soon. But sure. What are your thoughts on this, Steven?
No, I'm interested to hear the list. I'm kind of not quite sure what we're in for, but I enjoy a lot of, especially older to like late 90s, very early 2000s Disney films. A lot of the newer stuff has really felt like, kind of as we've talked about before, recycled, riskless, spineless stuff to basically just make a cheap buck and throw onto a streaming service. So a lot of it, I'm sure, will be kind of in that wheelhouse, but there have been a few exceptions, so I look forward to us talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, back in the day, you had a lot of variety to live-action Disney movies, but it seems like virtually every live-action Disney movie from the past 10 years or so has just been a live-action remake of an animated movie. But I'll get to that pretty soon, later in this video. So, the first movie I want to talk about is The Black Hole. The Black Hole was from 1979, and historically it was the first live-action Disney movie, well, live-action animated, just a movie from Disney that was rated PG at the time. It was them trying to make a sci-fi movie that was kind of like a disaster flick that was popular at the time in the 1970s because of cynicism at the time. And The Black Hole, I thought, was a fine-ish movie. I think some of the effects were pretty impressive for the time, especially the miniature work. I liked hearing Ryan McDowell voicing the character Vincent. And of course, when it comes to voice acting, I know him best as the voice of the Mad Hatter on Batman the Animated Series. I also loved his work in the original Fright Night from 1985. And as for the ending kind of comes off as a little bit random. In fact, the people who made this movie admitted that they just made up the ending on the fly. They didn't really have a solid ending, so they just kind of made up a bunch of stuff and decided to find out what stuck and just went with it. And that's why this movie feels a little bit iffy, at least in my opinion. So, and oddly enough, a woman that was considered to play one of the leads of the movie was Sigourney Weaver. But someone at Disney thought that, well, her name sounds a little bit too weird to pronounce, so we're just going to pass on her. And the irony is that she would later that same year would star in another sci-fi movie in space called Alien. So I'm really happy she didn't get to be in this movie, instead got to be an alien instead, a far better movie than this one. So on an A to an F scale, I would give The Black Hole a C.
Interesting. Yeah, I actually knew nothing about this film. I kind of am curious now and want to go back and look into it a little bit, but definitely can't argue with Alien being probably significantly better from what I'm seeing just from the images. Looks kind of Lost in Space-ish a little bit. Not entirely sure, but I'm curious to know more about it. That's definitely one that just completely escaped my realm of knowledge.
I see that, and the odd thing about that too, connected to that and the Universal Monster movies, is that around the time they're actually shooting Alien over in England, they also were shooting the 1979 Dracula movie with Frank Langella. And I remember reading about it, and some guy who was working on that movie ended up visiting the set nearby, and they were like, oh, this is pretty impressive, the set for Alien. And they were filming those movies at the same time, really close by to each other. I'm trying to remember if it was at the same studio, or maybe they were close by to it. It was the same country regardless. But yeah, so after that is Midnight Madness. So Midnight Madness is basically, I do agree with the critics on this one, that it's basically a Animal House wannabe. In fact, one of the actors from Animal House is in this movie. It wasn't John Belushi, it's some other guy who's in it. And the irony is that the guy who directed Animal House, who later directed An American Werewolf in London, the main character of that movie is also in Midnight Madness as well. I did enjoy the parts where they're going around Los Angeles at nighttime, going around various places. And also was the film debut of Michael J. Fox, who at the time was about 18, and the movie played a teenager in the movie, at least someone who was a little bit younger. And the reason why they cast him was that he was legally an adult, but they could get around the child labor laws because they were filming most of the movie at nighttime. But for me, this movie is just kind of painfully generic and just kind of not that funny of a movie, I would say. And also related to Disney with this movie is that one of the women in this movie, who's a groupie of one of the main characters, she would later be in one of the Friday the 13th movies wearing a Mickey Mouse t-shirt. So on an A to an F scale, I would give Midnight Madness a D+.
Wow, even lower. This is another one I knew absolutely nothing about and was just summoned from the aether of nothingness.
Summoned like a demon?
Yeah, it looks, again, from what I'm seeing, almost kind of like one of those very try-hard Nickelodeon shows where it's like they were moving away from animation and it kind of just sucked. That kind of is the vibe I'm getting from just what I'm seeing. But while I am curious about the Black Hole movie, I'm not curious about this at all. So
I see. And also, Cartoon Network was guilty of that too.
True, yeah.
Except they learned their lesson a lot faster.
Yes.
They didn't have a creeper who was into feet.
Yep.
That we know of, but
that we know of. Maybe it was another part. Hands, ears. But yeah.
Yeah, oh boy. They probably wore out that VHS tape of Cinderella.
Yes.
No one. Quentin Tarantino.
Well, that was Bill Cosby. He was Nick, I think. Right?
Wait, Nick? Who?
Yeah, he was on Nickelodeon shows.
I don't remember that.
I don't know, but Bill Cosby was into Sleeping Beauty. With that's what I'm saying. But
don't ruin that. That's a great movie. In my opinion, that's the best climax in any Disney movie. Fight me on that.
Bill Cosby would agree. What?
Oh no! Boomerang. Okay.
No, I agree. That is a great movie.
All right. So The Watcher in the Woods. Yes, trying to get away from that connection you were mentioning. Trying to, but that's the next movie I'm talking about. So The Watcher in the Woods was kind of like them, again, trying to get in the fads of the time. Like, okay, horror movies are popular, like The Exorcist and The Omen, so we're going to try to go with that one. And I did like Bette Davis in the movie as one of the supporting characters, and there was some scary stuff here and there, but kind of like The Black Hole, they did kind of make up the ending. They came up with like 100 endings or so. The original ending was supposed to be like an alien comes down, like an animatronic alien, but when they test screened it to audiences, I remember some critics at the time called it Bette Davis versus the Alien, is what they called it. So they ended up changing the ending to basically be a little more supernatural and less science fiction. So I will say Watcher in the Woods was kind of showing how Disney was struggling to try and be a little bit edgier with PG, but at the same time, they were trying to not hurt their brand of being a family company like, Disney with that name with it, which is what Ron Miller was trying to do, the son-in-law of Walt Disney. He was trying to do that, and eventually he was the one who decided to create Touchstone Pictures, which that way Disney could have its cake and eat it. And that was a very successful way they were able to make these movies with their, Touchstone Pictures with that label they had with it. But yeah, The Watcher in the Woods is it's kind of just average a little bit in a way. I'd like it more than Midnight Madness a little bit, but a little bit less than The Black Hole. So I would give this movie a C-.
Interesting. Yeah, this one I feel like I may have seen bits and pieces of. It feels from so long ago I can't even quite place from where. But this is another one that at least the premise and what I'm seeing looks like it has potential. I definitely like some mystery, sci-fi, fantasy elements in my preferred film and TV consumption. So this is definitely one that I would give a chance, but I can't speak with much authority.
Okay, so the next one is Dragonslayer. Now what's significant about this one is that it was a joint venture with them and Paramount. And the thing is that at the time, Michael Eisner was at Paramount Pictures. And in a way, Michael Eisner was trying to be brought over by Ron Miller to help up the side of the movie division at Disney. And ironically, Michael Eisner became the CEO of Disney, which I'll get into a little bit more later. So this one was they were trying to get into the fantasy element at the time, and they're also trying to get into the popularity of Dungeons & Dragons at the time. This one, I feel like it was a little bit fine. It does kind of feel a lot out of place by the early 1980s because this one, of course, was inspired by Vietnam with the whole draft at the war at the time with the whole lottery system of the Virgin Maiden being sacrificed to the dragon. But I think the problem with this one is that it's a little bit too cynical, like the 1970s, and by the 1980s, people were being a little bit more optimistic about the future by that point in time. So this one is kind of like Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, where if it was made a little bit sooner when the idea was made at the time, it probably would have done much better, or at least it probably would have been better received. But by that point, it was kind of like one of those fads at the time where it's like, yeah, this is obviously a byproduct of a previous decade or kind of a fad at the time that people kind of moved away from. So I think the effects are pretty impressive what they were able to do with this one with the dragon. They invented this kind of motion. I can't remember what it was called. I think it was Go Motion. I forget what the exact technology was called, but it was basically allowing Blur to go into the motion of an animatronic kind of stop motion character. And Ray Harryhausen, who was one of the grand masters of that kind of technique, visited the set, and they used various computers in that. And when George Lucas saw a cut of this movie, he was like, oh, this is going to do pretty well, but it ended up not doing very well when it came out. But it was nice to know that George Lucas did like this movie and did approve it. And the people who worked on this movie, who were writers and director, the guy who directed it, but he also was a writer on it, and some other guy was a writer on it too, they actually knew George Lucas, and they were able to visit ILM when he was developing that. And this was the first ILM movie, or one of the first ILM movies, where George Lucas was not involved with in terms of making this movie happen. But overall, I would say Dragonslayer is just kind of fine. But the irony is that Ian McDiarmid, who of course would later play Palpatine and Darth Sidious in those movies, is in this one just very briefly as a priest that gets lit on fire by the dragon. And I like the design of the dragon too. And this movie would inspire various other people, such as George R.R. Martin, who later made Game of Thrones, and Guillermo del Toro, who of course became a very successful movie director. In fact, he was one of the guys who worked on the commentary track with the movie's director when it was released on Blu-ray and 4K recently. So on an A to F scale, I'm conflicted by this one, but I know there are fans of this one, that's fine, but I would give this movie a C+.
Interesting. Yeah, again, hate to be repetitive, but I know very little about this one. I don't think I have seen anything concrete from it before, unless maybe just in passing when I was a kid, but this one definitely looks more interesting. It kind of reminds me from what I'm seeing of Dragonheart a little bit. Which I do recall loving as a kid, because I was a big knights and robots kid. But yeah, this definitely looks like it has more potential, kind of along with the Black Hole.
Okay, but I will say that either of those movies would be much better than Aragon.
Fair, absolutely. Yeah, the Aragon I remember reading as a kid and being really disappointed that what we got was what we got, and that there's been no attempt since then at trying to adapt it properly, because at this point there's no excuse. Even if you try to do it cheaply on a streaming service, it's probably going to end up being as good or better than what we got. I say that, and then it's going to be immediately disproven, where it's like the dragon has like a half-shaven afro or something, and it's like, well, okay, I ate my words. This was terrible. But, no, I definitely would welcome attempt at that again.
Okay. So there was this movie called Condorman, which was it was based on a book called The Game of X, I believe it was called, but basically this was one like, let's cash in on the Superman movies of the time. Let's try to do something superhero related. And this is just a flat-out bad movie. Everything from it trying to be super diet and lame version of James Bond at the time. Like even the Roger Moore movies, how campy they were at the time, is better than this. Has to be Condorman. And also, I'm trying to remember the actor's name. He was in Gladiator. He ended up dying at the time. And he was actually he was an alcoholic so much during making this movie that he ended up like throwing his tuxedo into the Mediterranean at this hotel they're staying at, and they had to like fish it out because the budget was so limited. And this one, I'm trying to remember the exact details about it, but from what I recalled with it, it was just a generic movie that was, well, even worse generic, just a bad movie where it was trying to cash in on not just Superman, but also James Bond at the time. I think the only redeeming quality is kind of the opening credits where you have this animated version of Condorman flying around. And that was done by a Disney animator who would later go on to animate much better characters and much better movies than this one. So I would give Condorman a D-.
Yeah, again, haven't seen it. This looks like a complete potato. Would skip. Not much more to say on that.
Even an Irish person would throw it in a dumpster?
Oh yeah. No, this is... I mean, the images are just... embarrassing. Like, I'm just looking at this one, and it's like someone made a terrible cosplay. Yeah, this is a lemon.
But I will say that the actress who played her was pretty attractive, that lead lady in the movie. In fact, Ron Miller, the then president of Disney at the time, I believe he was a president or a CEO, I forget what the exact position he had at the time of the company when the movie came out, but he said that she was basically the sexiest woman in a Disney movie. That was like his quote at the time.
What was his catchphrase? I'm gonna give you the bird.
Yeah, I mean, well, sounds like a better explanation than the Birdman guy who lays an egg with a man. They must, Mr. Eagle, I think it was.
Oh yeah, those terrible commercials.
Wait, there was more than one?
Yeah, there were several.
I thought there was just one. They just repeated it or something.
I think there was at least two. But yeah.
Okay. Anyway, so moving on to a much better movie. I think a lot of people agree with this one. It's pretty good. And that is Tron, the original Tron from 1980s. It was pretty solid. I remember watching this one for the first time back in high school. It was back with Mr. G's class, back in his algebra class, I believe. And I remember it was after school we watched the movie. I remember there was a moment where a character screamed very effeminately, like, ah, when like the train, not that train, but the tank was about to destroy him or something like that in the beginning of the movie. And this girl next to me, like, pretty much almost spat out her Fritos or something she was snacking on. But yeah, I like this one. It's pretty good. I like Jeff Bridges in the movie, and I like what they were trying to do at the time in terms of visual effects. Believe it or not, this movie was not nominated for an Academy Award for Best Effects because at the time they thought that computer effects was cheating. Imagine that now, that using that argument. But it's a pretty solid one. I think the pacing may be iffy at times, and maybe there's some effects through like, watching this in higher definition looks maybe not the best and some exposes some flaws with it, but this is a pretty solid movie. It definitely gained a following, and of course it got a few sequels like Tron Legacy and now Tron Ares that's coming out later this year. At least by the time this video's come out, it'll be later that the year, future tense obviously. And of course they had this ride, Tron Cycle Coaster, that's pretty impressive. For I gotta say I've been on that, but yeah, I did like Tron. It's pretty solid, very entertaining movie, and it's one of the few failures I cover in a book that ended up turning a profit and became a successful franchise. But overall, on an A to an F scale, I would give Tron a B. So what did you think of Tron?
Yeah, Tron is the first one that I have seen, and I definitely enjoyed it a lot more. I actually probably want to rewatch it after this just because it's been a while, but I definitely think some of the visual effects at this point, for obvious reasons, feel a little dated or at least worn, and that's okay. I mean, a lot of things change as time goes on, but it was pretty impressive, and the premise was, I think, among the newer, better, entering a cyber world stories that really inspired a lot of things like The Matrix and things like that going forward, even if it's in more distant, abstract ways. And I really like the visual style, especially carried forward into the Tron Legacy film and the I think there was a Tron show for a little bit. But I really like Tron. I like the concept, and I recall liking the story of the first Tron more than Legacy. But I would definitely agree with you that this is probably a mid to high B film overall. Like it doesn't hit all the A markings, but it definitely is a fun story that still sees a modicum of interest and success for a reason.
Yeah, I think with Tron Legacy, I enjoyed parts of that movie, especially visually. I think the first half is good. I just felt like it kind of blew its load a little bit too early. In the second half, it kind of goes downhill a little bit, at least in interest for me. But I'm interested in Tron Ares and see where they deal with that one.
I agree, and also, I don't know, the makeshift Clue clone that was basically digital. It didn't look the best and kind of undersold the rest of the film in its visual effects department, but also he was kind of just underwhelming as a villain. He was there, but it just felt like an obligatory villain. So I think going forward in Ares, it would be better to have someone with stakes or, some investment in the Tron world that was more in line and felt cool like the first one did. I agree with you, though, that the visuals for the time, I still think back to them as like, yeah, this was really cool, and the Daft Punk soundtrack was just like, I miss things like that these days.
Yeah, same here. And that was when, in my opinion, Olivia Wilde was at her peak.
Mm-hmm. Olivia Gone Wild.
Yeah, hashtag Harry Styles, but... Yeah, I haven't seen that Don't Worry Darling movie yet, but I'll plan on it anyway.
Well, don't worry, darling. Don't worry about it.
All right, so speaking of movies that are interesting, so the last one that Michael Eisner, well, actually it was Ron Miller was involved with it, and by the time that it came out, Michael Eisner was the CEO of Disney, and the thing is that when Michael Eisner became the CEO of Disney, he decided to remove the whole thing of Disney being a family company from basically their motto, I believe, from their business cards. I forget exactly where it was from, but basically there was an interview from this guy who wrote a similar book to mine that was pretty good on point of the various problems with the Walt Disney Company during the time of Michael Eisner. But the last movie that Ron Miller was involved with that was released during the Michael Eisner years was a movie called... Well, actually, no, sorry, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. There's one movie I forgot to mention. And this movie is called Something Wicked This Way Comes. It was based on a Ray Bradbury story. And this one, I thought it was kind of a little generic in ways. Like, it was one where it was meant to be a little bit more dark and serious, but they kind of toned stuff down and also kind of held back on visual stuff. I did like Jonathan Pryce as the main villain, Mr. Dark, in the movie. In fact, he's a tall guy, but they actually had him wear these special shoes that make him even more taller in appearance. And this one is... I guess it's fine. It feels like nowadays this would be like a Disney Channel movie, or at least something that would go to streaming. And there was a moment where they end up like reshooting with these kids. They end up having like a bunch of spiders in this room. And you can tell it's a reshoot because the kids are noticeably older looking because they reshot this scene like a year later. And this one, I'm trying to remember exactly what I had with this opinion-wise. And this movie and also The Black Hole and other ones I'm going to mention later on, there are talks about rebooting or making a new version of it. But they haven't made one since then. In fact, with The Black Hole, I forgot to mention this, but they were trying to remake The Black Hole from the director of Tron Legacy. But the problem was that when they wrote the script, it was criticized by being too similar to Interstellar in ways. Mm-hmm. So on an A2S scale, I would give Something Wicked This Way Comes a C+. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, this one, again, sorry to be repetitive, I have not seen, but in looking into just like a first assessment of it, it kind of looks like a Hell World Willy Wonka.
Evil Willy Wonka.
Right. When Willy Wonka comes to your town, but it turns out he works for Epstein, you know, that type of thing. But yeah, no, it's this one, I agree with your assessment. It looks very made for TV, or like they expected to do it direct to home, but it does have a couple of names that are still relevant today in terms of acting, and I would be curious to see it. I definitely like dark twists on kids' movies, so I definitely think this one has potential, albeit it's probably not good. It's not one you hear over and over again for a reason. So I definitely am curious about this one. I'm adding a lot of these that I'm hearing to my watch list, but this one definitely seems like no Tron.
Okay, yeah, I see that. So the one I was getting ahead of myself and mentioning, I was building up to, was Return to Oz. So Return to Oz is one of those movies from the 1980s that was a kids movie, but was seen as like a scary kids movie at the time, similar to The Secret of Nymph in a way. And I do like Return to Oz. I think in a way it definitely had some very impressive effects for its time, with everything from the stop motion kind of creature effects with gnomes and various animatronics and makeup work for this one. But at the same time, I felt like the ending was a little bit generic, at least in my opinion, towards the end, how they played that out. But this one, I feel like, is a fairly fine live-action Disney movie. It gained a cult following afterwards, especially for being considered one of the scariest kids movies of its time. So on a to an F scale, I would give Return to Oz a B-.
This is one I have seen, so I definitely overall agree with Tyler. I like certain aspects of this film, and while it doesn't hold a candle in quite a few aspects to the original for how big the production was, how timeless the villain and some of the characters are, and kind of doing a recycled version with archetypes as opposed to, just literally the same characters again. I did actually find a lot of interesting aspects and value to this film. I really liked the dark introduction of, this is terrible, I'm forgetting her name, Dorothy. Dorothy coming back, and her family's like, "You're insane, you're going to be electrocuted until you're normal." That was a pretty dark opener, but I there was some realism, especially for the time, that I was like, I appreciate them adding this sort of, I'm going off into Fantasyland. You're going to conform or you're going to be beaten. Just like, that was interesting. I do think, the concept of the villain was a really interesting idea to kind of add to the lore of the land of Oz. And the one thing I didn't like was their attempt at the flying monkeys basically being like, I feel like a very common depiction of the time of just like edgy punk skater people.
Oh yeah, the rollers, I believe they were called.
The rollers, and it's just like that type of just punk character showed up a lot in the 80s and was so tired. But like other than that, I thought it was an interesting take, and especially for something that's like, you're going to experiment and it's not going to be as good as the first one, but you want to expand the lore. I appreciated it. And I think people that have an open mind, especially, like, I would be curious to hear more thoughts and see people's perspectives on the film. If you have Disney Plus, I do believe it's still on there currently. I could be wrong about that, but when I checked recently, it was still there. So definitely give that a watch, and I would definitely recommend it. I don't think it was Tron level, but I would agree with like a B- is probably an appropriate categorization for it.
Okay. So after that is a movie that I consider one of my favorite live-action Disney movies, and it's one of my favorite movies I cover in this book, and that is The Rocketeer. The Rocketeer is a movie that was directed by Joe Johnston, who of course directed another movie I'm going to cover in this book later on, which I'll explain, but also he directed the 2010 remake of The Wolfman that I cover in my book, 100 Years of Universal Monster Movies. But the thing is, The Rocketeer is just a fun, escapist, optimistic movie that I just love a lot. I've seen this movie several times, and I just love this movie. It was just such a fun movie, and very wholesome. Just a movie that does have, action and violence in it, but it feels like the kind of movie you can show kids and it would be fine with it. I do like the hero's journey aspect of it. I do like how it plays with history, with how Howard Hughes is the one developing this rocket pack, and how, Nazi Germany was doing their whole tour thing and then trying to get the rocket pack technology. And also, I can't remember the actor's name, but Timothy Dalton's character is basically an inspiration of a certain Hollywood character, Errol Flynn. I think it was Errol Flynn. It was rumored that he was someone who was like a Nazi sympathizer, or maybe he was like drunk one time and walked around with that at one point, but I can't remember the exact details of it. But yeah, and with this one, I just enjoy this one a lot. And I gotta say, on top of that, this movie has the most attractive woman in any Disney movie, and that would be Jennifer Connelly as the love interest character. So, I'm just going to leave it at that. So, and on top of that, the lead actor played the Rocketeer. He also was in Bram Stoker's Dracula as Quincy Morris, just a year after this one. Him and Jennifer Connelly were engaged at one point, and then eventually broke it off. But they fell in love during making this movie. And yeah, they just announced it basically while promoting it, and it was just like a dream come true for the people making this movie for publicity. And they're like, "Oh, these two are actually engaged," and they're like, "Well, we didn't feel like keeping it a secret, just decided to let the cat out of the bag and not make it a mystery about it." So I think The Rocketeer is a fun movie. I highly recommend it. So on A to an F scale, I would give The Rocketeer an A-.
Wow, this is one that I've heard about and haven't gotten to as of yet, but I have seen bits and pieces of it. And especially for a lot of the style of it. Certain things remind me a lot of... this almost feels like a character extracted from Metropolis, which is a very old, classic piece of cinema, if you haven't looked into it. But this one definitely looks like it has a lot more potential. I don't think Again, not having seen it, I can't speak with certainty, but it kind of would be between Tron. I think it would be, probably be between Tron and Return to Oz for like how interested I would be on it. So I definitely think it's got a lot of potential, but again, not having seen it, don't have a whole lot to offer.
And the irony is that with this movie is that Joe Johnston directed this movie that's very much a period piece flick in similar tone, would direct another movie called Captain America: The First Avenger, which in my opinion is the most underrated movie in the MCU. That was like the last MCU movie before, Disney bought the company. That was the last one that Paramount was involved with before they would become Disneyfied with the Avengers and later on, where it seemed like everything became too jokey.
Mm-hmm. I agree. To be clear, I don't love the Captain America film. I would, for me, and I think Tyler and I have debated this, for me, my pick would be The Incredible Hulk. I really like, even more than the version of the Hulk we got going forward, that Hulk is my Hulk. But yes, I agree that there's a lot of interesting sort of period piece elements to this film from how it looks.
Okay. So the next one is one that a lot of people like a lot, and I think it's a pretty solid movie, is Hocus Pocus. Now, the main reason why this movie failed was that it was a Halloween movie released in the summertime. That was because Disney had another movie called The Nightmare Before Christmas that was coming around that time, and Tim Burton was a big name at the time. So they released this movie, and this is a pretty fun movie, very entertaining flick, with mainly the three leads of the movie are very funny and work great together, like the Three Stooges with magical powers. In a way, it actually is pretty good, unlike Maleficent, where you turn the three good fairies into Three Stooges with magical powers, which is really bad. But yeah, I like this one a lot, and I think it was the only movie that actually thought Sarah Jessica Parker was attractive, at least in my opinion. That was one movie where I'm like, okay, I have the hots for her in this one with her makeup and everything else going on with it. And oddly enough, when I was reading into the history of this movie, I didn't realize this, but the lead actor of the movie, I'm trying to remember his name, how you pronounce it, but he was actually high in a few scenes because he experimented with cannabis, and the director confronted him, and he's like, are you high right now? Because he was missing his marks. And the actor confessed to this years later, and it's not like a rumor or anything like that. He confessed this in an interview. And originally Leonardo DiCaprio was offered the part, but he turned it down because he was working on What's Eating Gilbert Grape. And yeah, I like the cat in this movie a lot. Binks, he's probably my favorite character, and I like how they did the animation for his mouth. It was pretty good for its time. But yeah, this is a pretty fun movie. Definitely a pretty good Halloween movie. It definitely gained a cult following, and it's very iconic. So on an 8 to 12 scale, I would give Hocus Pocus a B+.
Interesting. Yeah, this is one I have seen. I've seen it and the second one. Just because I felt obligated, but this is one that definitely feels like in that weird magical spot nostalgically between, like, this definitely wasn't one that as an adult you can say, yeah, this belongs in theaters, but it feels like a little more than just Disney straight to TV stuff. It's kind of in this weird middle block, but I do recall it was basically just a straight to TV movie, and I did enjoy it for the time. It was a lot of fun, and growing up and revisiting it, there are definitely elements of it that feel less impressive than when you're a kid, but it's enjoyable and it's a lot of fun, especially for Halloween. And I'm glad that there are still films like this that gain a cult following. So for me, this is one I'd probably give like a high C+, something like that.
Okay, I see that. Now, the thing is that, oddly enough, you were mentioning that, so it was rumored that it was going to go direct to video or just for TV, but I think this was always meant to be a movie in theaters. And the thing about it is that, a funny thing I was reading about when I was doing research for this, is that one of the actresses playing the witches in the movie, I forget what her name was, it wasn't Bette Midler or Sarah Jessica Parker, the third one, where she's like, well, I just want to make sure it wasn't offending anyone who practices witchcraft. And I'm like, yeah, this is nothing new, folks.
Yeah, I don't even know what to say to that, but I'm glad we're still on this because I forgot to mention Sarah Jessica Parker. I only saw a horse in a witch costume. What do you mean? But yeah. Watch me, nay, nay.
Yeah. I mean, everything was stable on set, but...
When she says she's looking for a stable relationship and pulls up at the farm. Yeah.
But speaking of her, there is a actor that she's married to that's also in a movie I cover in this book. But I'll get to that pretty soon. So the next movie is Nixon. So this is a biopic on Richard Nixon. I was debating whether to cover this one or not, but because of the fact that Disney became more noticeably political as time went by, especially during the Michael Eisner years, someone who was openly a Democrat who donated to Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton was the first president to lend his voice to the Hall of Presidents for the animatronic for that show itself. Kind of showed how Disney would shift. They were kind of like a little bit leaning right because Walt was more of a conservative guy later in life. But the thing is that they were more centrist, maybe objectively right-leaning, but they became noticeably more left-leaning as time went by, especially under the Michael Eisner years and, of course, Bob Iger. But I'll get into more of that as you read the book, of course. So Nixon was made by Oliver Stone, who's a very controversial director, very politically charged. And the thing is that I like some of Oliver Stone's movies. I liked The Doors and Platoon. And even, JFK was just a fun rabbit hole to just go down that path of what was really going on. In fact, I thought that Snowden movie he directed was underrated. That one with Jake Gyllenhaal. I think that was Joseph Gordon-Levitt. I don't know why I say Jake Gyllenhaal. Joseph Gordon-Levitt was in that one. And yeah, I think it's an underrated one. But the problem with this one is that it's just way too long. It feels a little bit like a hit piece on Nixon. I know they did the research with this one, but there are times where they definitely feel like they're exaggerating moments of Nixon. And it's from a boomer who obviously has out for Nixon. And I think in retrospect, I think Nixon as a president was overhated. I know that George Lucas kind of based Nixon, well, at least Palpatine, based on Nixon, of course, because he was part of that boomer anti-Vietnam era, around the time boomer aged person. But the thing is that I think he's more comparable to Lyndon B. Johnson because he actually got America involved with Vietnam. He had a financial investment in the military-industrial complex, very savvy politically. Well, Nixon actually got us out of that conflict just gradually. Just want to make sure that the Vietnamese actually stood a chance against Viet Cong. And of course, it did fall apart gradually, of course, through time, like it was eventually going to anyway. At least it wasn't bad like another place we ended up leaving that fell apart a lot faster. But anyway, I digress a little bit of tangent there. But yeah, this one, they show like Nixon like he was drinking and that, but there's been people who know him that saying like, yeah, I don't think he was really that drunk if he did. He kind of drank when he was VP during the 1950s, visiting Russia at one point. But other than that, he wasn't really that much of it. And also, there's this funny moment that feels very immature. There's a part where his wife is mentioning to him like if he wants to run for president again, and she basically says like, do you really want this, Dick? Yes, above all, or something like that. And if you read the I remember sharing that photo with you on Instagram in the story post, Messenger about that.
No.
Like it sounded really dirty.
It does sound really dirty.
But I gotta say, this commentary track I listened to just for this book for my research was really one of the cringiest moments I've heard in a commentary track. There's a moment where he's analyzing a speech that Richard Nixon gave when running for president in 1968. And there's a moment where it's like, this is hate speech. And I started bursting out laughing because I can't take anyone seriously. I can't take anyone seriously who says this is hate speech. Oddly enough, it's not the cringiest moment in a commentary track I've heard. The cringiest one is in The Mummy, Tomb of the Dragon Emperor. Rob Cohn, the director of the movie, was mentioning basically like in a tangent, it was during the middle of the movie, and he mentioned like, oh, just like how my man Obama is going to lift the curse that we have of the recession right now and bring everything up. And it was basically his plug-in for it, and it's just painfully dated, really bad. And I've never heard anyone in a commentary track endorse anyone for president or anything political like that. It was just so bad.
Interesting.
So on an A to an F scale, and this is both cuts of the movie, I would give it a D+.
Just to double check, does this have anything to do with Disney? Because there was a Disney theme, and then all of a sudden, like, is this not connected?
So it was made by Hollywood Pictures, and it was connected to Disney because Disney became a little bit more, political at the time, starting at this point, and became more noticeably left-wing, especially during the Michael Eisner years, and more so during Bob Iger after him in that, because Bill Clinton was the first president to do any kind of voice work for the Hall of Presidents when it came to the animatronics for that. So I mentioned that earlier. I don't know if you caught on to that. But
And he said that he did not have sex with that woman. You know, he had a good time, but that's just how it goes. You know.
Yeah. What's even more bizarre about the story is that the woman kept her dress that was stained, with his DNA, like.
Memories.
Some odd things in retrospect when you think about it. It's kind of like LA noir, like pressed out.
Yeah, but I have not seen this film. This is one I think that's also been on the bucket list, and I've seen other films by this director, but Nixon was definitely a controversial. He's kind of in the not great but not as bad as everyone makes him out to be tier. And Anthony Hopkins playing Nixon, that to me is kind of like, whoa. Like, I mean, Anthony's a good actor, but doesn't have that sort of Nixonian look that I would expect from today's casting. But in any case, it's one I'm curious about. I don't really have any authority at all to speak on it, but it's vaguely interesting, and I definitely agree with you about the Snowden film. The Snowden film I've seen, and it's good. I've also seen Vice, and that was interesting. That was the one about, I think, Cheney.
That was another director.
Yeah. I'm not saying, but like while we're talking political films, that was that was an interesting one. That one was clearly trying to go with a narrative as opposed to like, this is a relative kind of display of his overall life as opposed to like, this guy sucks. Like,
yeah, the guy who directed, Oliver Stone, later directed the movie W, which is a biopic on George W. Bush, which is kind of odd they made a biopic about George W. Bush when he was technically still president. I felt it was kind of odd you kind of rushed that out in a way.
That one I saw and recall thinking like, this was really average. Like, and maybe that is just like a accurate recalling of like the person as a whole, but like I remember just thinking like, this has all the hallmarks of being a presidential movie, but it feels like meh.
Yeah, it was just painfully mid. I'm just wondering, like, why did you make this? Like, it's just so they rushed it out. I think they should have allowed enough time to build up nostalgia. Because I think this movie would have come out maybe nowadays or maybe years later. I think you would have built nostalgia for like, remember the 2000s kind of thing. But yeah, the thing is, with that movie and also with this one Nixon, it was interesting. And also too related to what was connecting to with Nixon was that his iconic line with "I'm not a crook." You know where he said that at?
Where's that?
Walt Disney World.
Did he really?
At the Contemporary Resort, yes.
Wow, that is a bit of history, man. Hadn't put that together.
Yeah, which is another Disney connection. I don't know if I bring that up in my book, but I just think that's an interesting piece of history a lot of people forget about.
Mr. Mouse, I am not a crook.
Well, no, I think the Disney people or some over there are kind of crooks nowadays.
Oh, yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah, with all the reshoots and that, it's a kind of money launderers.
Remember who's paying you that cheddar, Mr. Nixon?
Slapping around like they do the Jonas Brothers in South Park.
Yeah.
We're spending much time on Nixon. I'm surprised how much time.
Yeah,
it's longer than his presidency. But all right, so next one is a controversial one called Kundun. So Kundun is a biopic on the Dalai Lama that Martin Scorsese directed. Now the thing is that someone at Disney, I'm trying to remember his name. I'm blanking on his name right now. But he knew Scorsese, he greenlit this movie for Touchstone Pictures, but China caught wind of this, and they got mad at Disney. And Disney did not want to jeopardize their relationship with China, because they were trying to build theme parks over there. They're trying to get their money. And then the problem was that they didn't want to anger people over in America, because they're like, you're bound down to this foreign power and that, and people in the entertainment industry were trying to undermine a well-liked director like Martin Scorsese. So they ended up releasing the movie, but they gave the bare minimum marketing and distribution, and then they outsourced it to a third-party company for foreign distribution, and it bombed at the box office. And it's hard to find this movie on physical media. Like, if you want to see like the Blu-ray, it's from a different corporation. It's rare to find this Blu-ray. It's very expensive. I don't know if it's streaming anywhere, but I think this is a pretty interesting flick. It's one that I think is pretty fine for a movie. It definitely has kind of a documentary feel to it. And the thing is that it was one of those movies at the time, like Red Corner or 7 Years in Tibet, that came out at that same time, where it was not really flattering of China. It was a little bit more critical of China. And I think it was like the last mainstream Hollywood movies to be critical of China, because afterwards they would really try to be overly chummy with that country. And I feel like more people should be more knowing about this one than Song of the South, because Song of the South's like, okay, you have, whatever you objectively see is problematic about that movie, but I think this is worse because unlike Song of the South, where it's basically about post-Civil War South in America, about this black guy befriending these white kids and that sort of deal, which I think is, okay. I think the live-action sections of Song of the South is pretty average, but then the anime sections are actually pretty fine. But I feel like with Kundun, it's like you're trying to ignore the fact that China killed a bunch of Tibetans because they saw Tibet as part of, China itself. Because I feel like people should be more upset about that. But on H1F scale, I think Kundun is a pretty interesting movie to watch, especially in Martin Scorsese's library. So I would give it a B-.
Interesting. Yeah, we've talked about this film before, and this is definitely... I have not seen it, but it is high on my watch list because, you know me, I love to watch like things that are edgy and or cause a lot of trouble in history. Those are directly in my wheelhouse, that sort of deviant gene in myself. But that's a really interesting... film. And it's interesting how in it being so controversial, everyone was just like, I didn't make this film, he did. I didn't make this film, he did. And is this part of Disney, or is it in like some very loose way?
Yeah, it was Touchstone.
Okay, so I want to just say to all my Kingdom Hearts fans out there, I can't wait for Sora, Donald, and Goofy to be fighting alongside the Tibetans and
the Heartless or the Communist Chinese.
and mentioning Song of the South, I can't wait for Sora, Donald, and Goofy to be fighting literally Jim Crow as like a big Heartless in a Klan hood or something like that.
There's no Klan members for the Song of the South.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, wasn't one of your friends surprised that Splash Mountain was actually based on a Song of the South movie?
I think they were, yes.
They had no idea. They're being super serious about it. And we're like, wait, you didn't know that?
That's right. But
that was hilarious. I didn't know that.
But yeah, I Song of the South is an interesting one. And you can see where, like, especially for the United States, in a sort of like, we're the center of reality type of narrative that we've given ourselves, where that would garner more attention than Kundun. That is not to condone it, but it's definitely understandable for historical reasons. Both are definitely worth seeing, though. Song of the South I have seen at this point, and it's pretty unremarkable, but it does have some historical value, but at the same time, I do have a lot of interest for Kundun as well, while not having seen it.
Okay. And then also, China banned Martin Scorsese for many years until, I believe, the early 2010s. And then Samantha Matheson, I think that's her name, she was the main writer on this movie. She was once married to Harrison Ford, and she was banned for that country for the rest of her life. And she ended up writing another movie called The BFG, which I talk about in my book as well. And she ended up being banned for the rest of her life. She ended up passing away before the BFG came out. But anyway, moving on. So, Meet the Deedles, I think that's how you pronounce the name. This is really bad. This is basically trying to be like a live-action cartoon starring Paul Walker, and I'm trying to remember the other actor's name. And then not Bob Hoskins. It was, who was the other guy from the Super Mario Brothers movie? He was also like the villain of the movie. He was also in a bunch of other... Dennis Hopper, that's his name. Yeah, he was in the movie too as a villain. And this is just really bad. This feels like a high-budgeted movie for Disney Channel at best. And it's just so many painfully unfunny moments where they're trying to be funny or kind of cutesy, but it's just really bad. It was just so bizarre that the script got greenlit, and everyone making this movie thought that we're making a fine-ish movie while making it, and then everything went into it, and even in post-production. And this is just bad, and one of the worst Disney movies I've seen, at least live action wise. And yeah, it's just really bad, just really painfully generic and just painfully unfunny to watch. Mm-hmm. And just really overly lowbrow. This feels like very little kids may mildly like it, or maybe just get bored with it. So on an A to F scale, I would give this one an F.
Ooh, that's pretty intense. You would say though, not ironically, with Paul Walker being mentioned, they may have driven it off a cliff.
Oh, there is a moment where they do go off a cliff, I believe, or at least towards the beginning of it. But they all survive. They go with good stunts. I mean, it even does have the same logic as like the Fast and the Furious franchise.
Yeah, that's why it's a fantasy, because he survived. But no, I have not seen this film, nor do I intend to, unless it's, I don't know, in the background at an airport and I don't have a choice. But, this looks pretty bad.
So, next one, you probably seen this one, Inspector Gadget. So, Inspector Gadget was with Matthew Broderick's in this one, of course, the husband of Sarah Jessica Parker. And the thing about this one is I remember as a kid liking the McDonald's toys, where it's basically various body parts of Inspector Gadget put together. That was, fairly enjoyable, nice nostalgia with that one. This one, from what I've read, the movie was a little bit longer, but they end up cutting stuff out from the movie. So every time you see like a transition on the screen of like a CGI thing of an Inspector Gadget or like a body part or of some gadget, that's actually to hide the bad editing that this movie had because they chopped stuff down for the runtime. But this is just, again, it's kind of like Meet the Deedles in that, where it's just not very funny. It's a lot of bad stuff in it too. The reason why I don't give it an F grade is that it's just, in ways, some scenes, like, it's so bad it's funny at times. Like, I kind of laugh at how incompetent, especially with how Matthew Broderick takes the role. Like, especially how he drastically shifts acting-wise and acting. Like, when he wakes up in the hospital, he's like, "No! I gotta get out of here." Remember that? It is just great, hilarious. So, on to an H-F scale, I would give Inspector Gadget a D-.
Inspector Gadget I have seen, and it's been so long since I have seen it. I kind of have it in the same wheelhouse as Stuart Little, where it's like, I do recall as a kid seeing it and being vaguely positive, but just my memories of it are overall faint. What I do remember, I think I did relatively enjoy, but it did feel, I agree with your criticisms of Matthew Broderick. He definitely was going off or coasting off of, I guess, like Ferris Bueller and stuff like that for a while.
And then recently Godzilla.
Yeah, and Godzilla.
That's a lot of fish.
But he definitely had this... He himself is a weird character in Hollywood history because he's very average outside of, like... At least to me, maybe I'm biased, but Ferris Bueller was clearly like, he excelled in this role, and then they just wanted like a socially awkward guy in a bunch of roles that didn't really work, but like it was okay outside of that, but not great. And that's kind of how I feel about, like, there are more positives to Godzilla, that original from the early 2000s. Then
late 90s.
Or late 90s, excuse me.
Remake.
Then Inspector Gadget. But I kind of have a similar feeling of, like, it was fine. So my grade scale, again, Warren, I haven't seen this in at least over 10 years. But I think something in a C area was probably more than fair for it. Because it definitely, like... It skated by, but it wasn't remarkable.
Okay. So going into the 2000s, we have Mission to Mars, which was one of the first of several Disney movies based on a theme park ride. And this was directed by Brian De Palma, who was best known for directing movies like Scarface and The Untouchables. And of course, he's part of that film trope of the new Hollywood, people like Martin Scorsese, I previously mentioned, but also George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, Francis Ford Coppola as part of that. And Mission to Mars, it's kind of average. It's not the best paced movie in my opinion. It does have some effective dramatic moments, especially the moment where this CGI tornado comes to life as a defense mechanism for this alien thing. And this one part where this guy's like spinning around so dramatically that all of his like limbs rip off. And I'm just surprised seeing that they get away with that in like a PG-13 rated movie. Even though it's really fast, there's no blood, that's really dramatic and very violent for someone to die. But then the ending happens to Gary Sinise's character feels a little unearned in my opinion, a little bit of an odd dramatic moment that happens. In fact, the set where they're spinning around in, that a set that we see in the movie when they go into Mars, that's actually on the Mission Space ride at Epcot. And Gary Sinise is the one who does basically the host of the ride itself. When you go on it, it's really fun. I highly recommend it if you haven't been on it. But overall, Mission Mars was one of these several movies that they try to make into a movie, at least, and it didn't really work out. The only one that obviously worked out great was Pirates of the Caribbean. So on an 8-to-1 scale, I would give Mission to Mars a C+.
Mission to Mars, I do recall seeing when I was quite a bit younger, maybe in my very early teens or something like that. And yeah, it definitely felt in kind of a middle brow area. There's a lot of elements that kind of remind me of like a blur between the very ending of The Fifth Element, but then also like a lot of Armageddon in it, where it kind of just felt like a weird hodgepodge of a bunch of type of like space and alien movies. Not to spoil anything, but it is an old movie, and I definitely I agree with you that probably somewhere in the area of a C was fitting for it. Maybe a slightly higher, because I do recall having, a decently positive reception of it, but again, didn't make much of an impression other than, that.
Okay. So after that, another movie based on a theme park ride, or at least an attraction at the Disney parks, that I think is worse than this one is the Country Bears. Now, the Country Bears, I think the animatronics were impressive, but even some of the time the historian of the Disney parks was kind of had a big question mark over his head, like, why is this movie even getting made? And I did like the animatronics by Jim Henson and company, who worked on this movie with the animatronics and the bears. But yeah, it was basically just a cameo fest of like various singers who were popular at the time, and it was trying to cash in on like behind the music that you see on MTV. And this one really felt like it should have just gone to Disney, the Disney Channel, or maybe direct-to-video. It's kind of bizarre they even made this a theatrical release to begin with. I think the best part about this movie, aside from the animatronics, is Christopher Walken as the movie's villain. This isn't over, bears!
You bears! It's not over! Yeah.
I think Christopher Walken tends to uplift a movie that's very lousy.
For sure. No, I completely agree.
So on an 8-to-1 scale, I would give the Country Bears a D.
Yeah, I would say I do recall seeing this when I was much younger, and it was cute. I don't recall time-wise. I think this was around the time where Holes came out too, or at least that rough block of time, being much better than this. But yeah, this was a film that, film does not necessarily qualify. A movie, a thing of child slop to feed to children, that was super mid, but I did enjoy elements of zany goofiness from it, and for children it's at least bearable. But I agree with Tyler that this is probably best case scenario C-, more likely D+, type of kind of high-end invested straight to TV quality movie. And actually thinking back to it, it's interesting that Five Nights at Freddy's is basically like the bad ending but received better of the Country Bears concept, where it's about a bunch of animatronics except they kill people. It's like it's interesting to see how that concept of like animatronics has morphed into something more disturbing as time has gone on.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty true. So Well, the next one would have to be the Alamo. And the Alamo was one of the biggest box office bombs that Disney ever made. In the 2000s, it lost between $80 to maybe $100 million for its time. So it was based on, of course, the Battle for the Alamo. At the time, some critics review bombed it for political reasons, because George W. Bush was running for re-election. He was from Texas, and various critics were review bombing it because of the fact that they didn't like him and they didn't want him as president anymore. So they kind of spoke ill about this movie, which I feel like is obviously very biased and not the best way to review a movie necessarily with this one. So this movie was directed by a Texan. I'm trying to remember his name. He directed movies like The Blind Side and Save Mr. Banks and a bunch of other movies afterwards that have done much better than this one. And with Billy Bob Thornton as Davy Crockett, I felt like he did fine as that part. And historically, one of the guys who fought for the side of the Mexicans for Santa Anna's army, they did say that, Davy Crockett didn't go down fighting in the Alamo like we see in some ways that they kind of, make it legendary in that. But instead, he was captured, he was executed, but he did die with honor and dignity. And this one, I felt like it was kind of painfully mid. I think the problem with this movie is that, aside from the pacing, I felt like they try to overly humanize the characters to where it just kind of becomes a bunch of white noise. Mm-hmm. In a way, it just feels a little bit on autopilot too, especially in pacing, like I mentioned earlier, but also they cut out a lot of Dennis Quaid's scenes in which he played, I forget who it was, his last name was Houston, of course, a city was named after him later on, historically. But this one is interesting to watch, regardless what you think about the movie itself. So, on HMO scale, I'd give the Alamo a C grade.
Yeah, what was the person the city was named after? Whitney Houston?
Oh.
No.
Well, there was later a biopic about Whitney Houston.
Yes.
Later on. But yeah, I also it's interesting to know how they paid a lot of attention to detail with the set with this movie. I mean, they kind of adjusted the size of the Alamo, or at least part of it, for theatrical reasons, and they had changed the position of where the Alamo faced because of the lighting, because where the sun rose and set it and that sort of deal, just for lighting and that sort of deal. But everything else was pretty historically accurate. In fact, a lot of the extras who fought in the Alamo were actually descendants of people who fought and died in the Alamo itself. So I thought that was a pretty interesting attention to detail that they had.
So they had to destroy and rebuild the entire Alamo for screen accuracy. No, but this movie...
And they made sure they had Ozzy Osbourne defecate on it too, to christen it.
That's right. No, the Alamo is a very interesting historical event, and I I don't have a whole lot to add to this, but I definitely recall seeing at least some of this when I was younger. It's hard to place specifically, but my perception of the film was very similar to Tyler's. That I did like. I think Billy Bob Thornton was in it.
Yeah,
and Dennis Quaid. So some of the
Sam Houston was his name.
I see, and some of the actors' performances I recall liking, but the film was overall pretty mid for a historical piece. So I definitely I can't state with confidence what my review was, but it was probably in the upper to middle C range.
I will say a movie that is much worse than this one, and I'd rather watch The Alamo, is Around the World in 80 Days. This is really much a full Adam Sandler energy movie throughout. And yeah, Jackie Chan was in this one. He was paid a lot for it. I forget the exact number was it for, but I think it might be the only movie where both, I just blank out his name, the guy who voices Lightning McQueen in the Cars movies.
Yeah.
And then his brother, too. They actually play brothers in this movie. I think it might be the only movie where they're both in it, or especially at the very least, they're playing brothers in the movie. They play the Wright brothers, by the way, historically wise. This one I kind of covered, too, because Disney did release it, and you kind of connect it to the World Showcase Epcot, which I absolutely love. World Showcase Epcot, just trying all the food and various cultures, interacting with people who are actually from those countries to talk with. That's real. I love that aspect of it. It's pretty cool to go with it, but that was actually the first Disney park to actually introduce alcohol into the parks, which Walt Disney himself didn't really want alcohol in the parks himself because they want to get rid of that sort of deal that you see in the other theme parks when he was growing up. So he's trying to make Disneyland something where people could be sober and also enjoy themselves at the same time that was family friendly. But this one is just, again, not very good, just not that entertaining movie, not very good whatsoever. I know I'm kind of repeating myself with this one, but the thing is, a lot of movies are like this, which is part of the reason why they failed. And also Arnold Schwarzenegger is in this one. It's one of the last movies he was in before he decided to briefly go into hiatus, be the governor of California, and I think at the very least he was nominated for like a Razzie for this one. For worst supporting actor. I forget what was exactly the detail was, but on an H1 scale, I would give Around the World in 80 Days a D.
Yeah, this one I also recall seeing when I was a kid, and recalling it kind of felt like ye old and bad version of Rush Hour. Like
yeah, it was Jackie Chan.
Yeah, Jackie Chan being in it was, I think, not a coincidence, but I definitely recall this being kind of a mediocre movie, and probably there's a lot of details that are hard to remember, but it was kind of lowbrow slapstick, that type of thing. So I think probably a low C is where I would put it, because it technically constitutes a movie that is watchable, but not much more than that.
Okay, so this is the last movie that was involved with Michael Eisner before he was pressured to step down for various reasons I explained in my book. And of course, Bob Iger, who came from the purchase of ABC back in the 1990s, became the new CEO of Disney. So we're going into this part of it. And I forgot to mention too that unlike my Universal Monster book, where I vaguely mentioned Universal as a company, how they changed, and it was more a focus on the Universal Monster movie franchise, this one, the Walt Disney Company, like its history, does take more of a front seat to this one. And I do talk about the movies generally for Disney, and showing how the Disney Company had lost its identity from its founder, Walt Disney. But anyway, so going into the Bob Iger years, at least the first time Bob Iger was CEO before, Bob Chapek came in as a CEO in training. So we have the Sorcerer's Apprentice. So this one was them to try to cash in on the Harry Potter franchise. Disney actually failed 3 times to cash in on that. The first time they had the chance to publish the Harry Potter book series, but they passed on it, one of the many publishers that turned it down. And then they also had the chance to get the film rights, but they undersold how much money they wanted to give with it. But Warner Brothers was willing to pay a lot of money to get that, so they got that. And then at one point they almost were able to get the theme park rights for Harry Potter, but they were underselling what J.K. Rowling wanted in mind, so Universal went to her instead, and of course we had the Wizarding World of Harry Potter, the Universal parks. So we have Sorcerer's Apprentice, which is loosely based on a segment or inspired by a segment from Fantasia, the same name, with Mickey Mouse. And I gotta say, rewatching this thing, I actually like this one. I'm surprised how much I liked it. I think it's underrated. I do like the world building they have with it. I like the characters. Well, what's his name? The guy who plays the main character. I think he's not the best protagonist in my opinion. And this was just a fun movie, generally speaking, with all the magic and sorcery that are going on with it. And I know it's not a live-action Disney remake because it's more inspired by and not necessarily a direct remake of Fantasia, but I'd rather watch this over most of the live-action Disney remakes that Disney has made. And on top of that, I would rather be in this world than opposed to Harry Potter. Like, I'd rather be the main character, or at least one of the main characters in the story, romancing the likes of Teresa Palmer or Monica Bellucci over Emma Watson. Which I know there's someone we know that would strongly disagree with my statement on that. But.
Yes, they're coming this way as we speak with the car full speed to correct this, but no.
Yeah, I forgot to give my rating. Oh, yeah. So on an A to an F scale, I would give the Sorcerer's Apprentice a B.
Yeah, that's fair. I recall seeing this movie with my grandma actually in theaters, and I kind of have a very similar perspective to Tyler on it, that it was kind of surprisingly decent. I don't know why I have this specific thought about it, but it kind of, to me, is in a similar ballpark grade-wise and overall quality to, like, the Amazing Spider-Man movies, but from the opposite direction, where the Amazing Spider-Man movies felt like kind of a letdown from their predecessors, but still had a lot of oomph behind them. This had a lot of oomph, but I wasn't expecting a lot, so it ended up feeling a little better, but still clearly wasn't one of the greats. So I think this was more of a... also, it's a Nicolas Cage movie. That's something that we've got to mention, which he has definitely gained a cult following. And I definitely enjoyed this film. Certain details are hard to remember, but it was a lot of fun. And I recall at the time thinking of this as probably a mid to slightly lower B movie. Because of the overall quality. So I would definitely recommend it.
Okay, yeah, and one of my favorite moments of the movie is when they kind of do a nod to the Sorcerer Apprentice when they have the, mops come to life in that. That was great because it was a mixture of computer effects, but also they actually had real props, and they had these guys in green bodysuits, or is it green or blue? I forget which color it was exactly, but they were digitally removed, and they were able to move the mops around in that, so it looked photorealistic when they were moving around. I love how they were just, that was a funny nod to it, and I love the music hearing that, so that was great. And again, I like that better than the live action Disney remakes, generally speaking. So moving on, we have John Carter. Now, John Carter is one of the biggest box office failures that Disney has ever produced, or at least one of the biggest bombs in Hollywood history. Lost at least $200 million when it came out, and I gotta be honest, this is one of my favorite live action Disney movies. I think it's criminally underrated. I love the world building, the action set pieces, the attention to detail with the effects. I like the characters, how John Carter is someone who's a reluctant hero, which this one makes sense. He's passed from drama. He's trying to find a new cause to fight for, which he does find on Barsoom, which is the planet Mars in this story. And I like the chemistry between him and Deja Thoris. I also like Mark Strong as Matai Shane, the main villain, who's this basically someone who's really pulling strings as this villain. I want to see what they're going to do with the story-wise with it, too. It was just a fun movie. It's showing how this was based on a book series that inspired everything sci-fi that's popular, whether it be Star Wars or Star Trek or Flash Gordon, you name it. It basically inspired a bunch of even Dune as well. And yeah, I just love this movie so much. It's so excellent. And yeah, I just wish they would have made more of it. And the reason why it failed partially was because Disney, in my opinion, set out to die, because they're like, well, we bought Marvel Comics and we're going to get Star Wars, so we already have a firm grip on the boy demographics, so we're just going to let this movie die and just move on for safer franchises. But John Carter, I like this movie a lot. It was directed by Andrew Stanton, who directed Finding Nemo and WALL-E. I like this movie a good amount, but I would say it's probably my favorite movie he directed. So I would give John Carter, I think there's some pacing issues from here and there, but one of my favorite moment of this movie is the scene when John Carter fights a bunch of these savage, alien creatures, and he unleashes this, guilt and anger he's been suppressing throughout the movie, how he failed to save his family who died when he was gone. And that's one of the most perfect scenes I've seen in any movie. I actually get emotional when I see it. It's so beautiful how they edit that whole scene with the music and the action, sound effects. It's just so much oomph, and I just absolutely love it. It's one of my all-time favorite moments in any movie whatsoever. I think it's film perfection in my opinion. So on an A to F scale, I would give John Carter an A-.
Interesting. Yeah, this film I did see as well, and I overall am in a lot of agreement with Tyler that this is definitely a criminally underrated film, kind of along the lines of ones we've covered like Van Helsing, where it had way more right than wrong, and just for the time it was in, didn't get the appreciation it deserved. So I definitely agree, and obviously historically it inspiring Star Wars and things like that, I think offers a lot of value. And it's kind of an inversion of the Superman trope, where it's like, instead of an alien coming to Earth and it's super powerful compared to us, we go there and we're super powerful. And kind of how that plays through human morality is really interesting. I do think, for me personally, the villain was a little lackluster, but it is what it is. That's kind of down to personal preference. And but overall, I like the story a lot, and I definitely agree that it's an underrated film. So for me, it would probably score in the very high B range, like B+, talking like 88, 89%. But it's a good film, and I definitely recommend watching it. Definitely one of the best live-action Disney films.
Yeah, and then another one that came out a year after this one was also a big failure, lost about maybe $190 million, was The Lone Ranger. And I know that your father didn't like the idea of them making this movie. I remember back in the day. And oddly enough, you're mentioning how you took your grandma to see The Sorcerer Apprentice. Well, I took my grandma to see The Lone Ranger, and she liked it a lot. She was entertained by this movie, and think to myself, yeah, they should just bust a bunch of people from elderly people to see this movie. It probably would have actually been a hit film. Absolutely. If they would have done that. And she was also saying, who's that guy who plays the Lone Ranger? Or Armie Hammer? Yeah, he's so handsome. And I'm like, yeah, but I don't know if you would like to know what he's actually really like, allegedly from women who's dated him.
Imagine instead of like a bunch of young women preening around like an influencer, you just have like a senior citizen bus and like they're drooling all over Armie Hammer, like that would be a genuine sight to see.
I read somewhere they auditioned to play the Invisible Man in the 2020 version. I think in retrospect he should have played him, especially we know about him nowadays.
Yeah, it's kind of central casting,
Yeah.
He lives his values, in that sense.
But anyway, so as for the movie Lone Ranger, now I remember there was a controversy with it, with Johnny Depp playing Tonto, and he does claim to have American Indian heritage over on his like grandmother, great-grandmother's side of the family, and he did spend time with American Indians. I forget which tribe it was, and became an honorary member of their tribe. In fact, they gave him the name Mahu May, which means shapeshifter in their language, which shows how he's an actor. And then someone who's an expert in, I forget which language it was, but he was speaking in the movie. He's like an expert on it. For where Professor was, he said that, it was kind of shaky, but it was pretty accurate to that language with Johnny Depp was speaking in that movie. And it does amuse me how there are people who get offended by this when we're not even a part of that group of people. Because I remember back in college, there was one person who wasn't even part of this group who saw this like political ad, and they're like, I found that offensive. And I'm like, I highly doubt you're part of that group. Like, did this group of people, the council of them, vote together and say like, okay, you are our ambassador, you may be offended on our behalf? Yeah, that's pretty super narcissistic of them. But anyway, a little bit of tangent going back to the movie. So The Lone Ranger, I like the first part of this movie with the entertaining like train heist scene, this big train wreck that happens in the movie, which is of course foreshadowing the box office also this movie. And also the third act is super fun. I love the third act, big climax with another, train scene that happens. I love how it's edited. The music goes. It's like, I forget what the name of the song is, but it goes like, that one. Yeah, that's a super fun climax. It's super. I love it. It's just fun. But the big issue of this movie is that that middle slumps a lot. Like, they really should have shortened it, or at least made it more enjoyable and entertaining, like they did with the first Pirates of the Caribbean film, which, by the way, Gore Verbinski directed this movie, directed the first 3 Pirates of the Caribbean movies, and the people who wrote this movie, or at least 2 out of 3 of the writers who wrote this movie, were writers on some of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. And the other issue, too, is that this movie could have made up its mind if it was trying to be played all serious and realistic, or if it was going to embrace the supernatural. I did read an early draft of the script, was that it was a little bit more supernatural, but because of budgetary reasons and other stuff like that, they kind of were playing tug-of-war with it, and it's like, make up your mind which one's going to be. So this one, I like parts of this movie. I like the first act and the third acts, but that middle slumped a lot, so not 8 to F scale. I would give it a C+.
Interesting. Yeah, for full disclosure, I have not seen this. This is one that is on my list of films to see at some point, and I think my grandparents may have seen it as well because they reminisced about it from their days of youth. But yes, my dad was definitely like, "What are you doing releasing this in the year of our Lord 10 or something?"
2013.
2013. Yeah, but a few comments. Johnny Depp being cast, we should be grateful because it could have been with the same justification Elizabeth Warren. So I definitely approve of Johnny Depp over that. But
getting the wrong smoke signals from this.
Yes. Also, I'm glad they filmed this when they did instead of in Palestine, Ohio, over the past couple of years, because then there could have been even bigger disasters. And yeah, as for the... it's interesting you talk about the sort of spiritual angle, because there's been a lot of that. I'm trying to remember the last films that weren't just like outright Christian films, like God's Not Dead or something like that, where there's been a clearly sort of downplayed but secularized version of spirituality. I guess you could maybe make an argument of something like kind of Avatar, but not really, just because of the whole nature angle. But I do miss some of that, like just films taking a stand, because again, it comes down to risk aversion and not wanting to alienate audiences that aren't religious or something. But even if you're not religious, people like people with a spine and a message, and who aren't afraid to like commit to something. So this sort of weaselly, are we going spiritual, are we not? I would definitely encourage, because they're listening, but more films need to have a backbone and commit to something, because I feel kind of similarly about Prometheus, which was a horror movie that had a very clear, horror sci-fi movie, that had a very clear and very interesting premise, but because of its fear of like, oh, we don't want to offend people's religions, it kind of shot itself in the foot several times and has this sort of weird retrospective. So not to go too far off on a tangent, but I definitely think that it's not a coincidence we're seeing that problem, and we need more directors that are brave enough to go, I don't care, this is my beliefs, these are the beliefs I want to get across, deal with it.
Okay, I see that. So the next one is Tomorrowland. So Tomorrowland was based loosely on an area of the Disney parks, and this movie really comes across as a bunch of boomers kind of reminiscing about like, how come the future didn't turn out the way we imagined as kids and that? And I'm thinking to myself, well, if you want to know the answer, look in the mirror.
Yes.
I mean, you let yourself be basically manipulated by college professors and people in the entertainment industry is why it turned out that way, why people became so cynical. And I just gonna, say about that. And yeah, you allowed this to happen, basically. Is what I'm just going to say about it. And it's disappointing that I think this is the worst movie by Brad Bird, because I love a lot of Brad Bird's movies. I love The Iron Giant, one of my all-time favorite movies. Also, The Incredibles and Ratatouille are some of my favorite Pixar movies. He also did that Mission Impossible movie, the fourth one, which I think is overrated. But yeah, I think Brad Bird's much better in animation than live action on average. But this one's just painfully mid, very boring. So on an 8 to F scale, I would give Tomorrowland a C grade.
Yeah, this one I do recall seeing rather recently, not like last year or anything, but past 5-ish years, something like that, and I was pretty underwhelmed. George Clooney, I think, also just being in it as himself, no matter what. Like, at this point, he's just typecast as, I'm a handsome older guy, and this is just who I am. He's been that way ever since Batman. And Robin, and I'm tired of that role, but I agree with you that The Iron Giant and stuff like that are much stronger films in his resume, and that film I would definitely give like a solid C at best. It's not great, it's not even that good, it's just fine.
Yeah, a positive thing I'll say about it is that I like the transition effect when that one woman like touches the button thing or whatever it is, like transfers herself between our world and then like Tomorrowland. And also I liked the that one girl who's like plays Athena, Raffi Cassie I think is her name, as this animatronic cyborg character. She was actually pretty good in the movie too, what she was able to do in that one for the standards of child actress at the time. But anyway, so the next one is The Finest Hours. So this one is based on a biopic of the same. Well, it's based on a true story of this daring Coast Guard rescue attempt in the 1950s. And this one is just painfully mid. It's kind of like the Alamo, where it's just kind of like, okay, it's a basic biopic story based on a true story. But I don't have much to say about it because it's just kind of whatever. I give it a C+. A little bit better than Tomorrowland, but not by much.
This should have been called what a movie this year I think that came out was called, and I laughed as soon as I saw the title. The boys in the boat. That basically feels like this film. I have not seen it. I know of it, and I've heard.
Oh, another George Clooney directed movie.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah.
Another very lukewarm, movie, and it does have Chris Pine in it, and I do like Chris Pine. I think he's a little underrated at this point, personally. But other than that, no comment. It'll pass is just whatever.
Okay, quick trivia fact is that, did you know that Chris Pine's grandma was Annie Gwen? She was in House of Frankenstein that came out about 80 years ago, at least by the time I'm recording this video. And yeah, she said that was actually the best movie she was in, or one of her favorite movies she was in.
I did not know that. Another trivia fact is that the car pine trees are invented by them. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, that is interesting.
All right, so the next one is Alice Through the Looking Glass. Now, I think it's one of those rare sequels that I think is better than the first one, but just by inches. This one, I did like a little bit of the lore, world building they were trying to do with the history of the characters they had with it. And this one was directed by a guy who actually liked Alice in Wonderland, the books themselves. I mean, Tim Burton did the first one. Wasn't necessarily a fan of the Alice in Wonderland stories, or at least from what I've gathered from my research. And the guy who directed this one, he also did the recent Muppet movies. He actually liked the Alice in Wonderland movies, and part of the reason why it failed is that it came out the same weekend as X-Men Apocalypse, which we like that one. We think it's an underrated movie. And I mean, that Sorcerer Apprentice, backtracking a little bit to that one, is that it came out the same weekend as Inception, so that's why it failed big time with that one.
Yeah.
But with Alice in the Looking Glass, I feel like it's just fine as a movie. I think you might like it a little bit because Sacha Baron Cohen's in it as Time itself in that. But yeah, this one what also hurt it too was that around the time it was the Me Too movement, and at the time Johnny Depp was going through a controversial separation and later divorce from Amber Heard. And a lot of people at the time believed her side of the story, so they were calling for boycotts in the movie, which I do mention in my book. But this one, Alice Through the Looking Glass, it's okay. So I give it a C grade.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. I recall both Alice in Wonderland movies being the most just, like, oversold, normal, but not good-looking fantasy dreck that I've seen in a long time. I would like to see an attempt at these movies that is good, or like tries to do it, with a little bit of creativity and backbone and some budget behind it to make it actually qualitative. But I would rewatch the animated version over any of these any day. I recall the Jabberwocky being just a complete butt pull in the first one. But I think if I had to say something positive about the movies, I did like the Red Queen casting choice. I think that
Helena Bonham Carter.
I think she was very appropriate for that role. But that's about all I can say. Even Johnny Depp in his role was okay. Like, it was just, he's a lot better in Pirates of the Caribbean and other roles he's played. So this was just a remarkably... It's kind of the definition of a C movie to me, because it's like, it's got the funding behind it, it's got some names that should mean success, but you get just something that's ultimately going to be tolerable in the background. And that's all it really accomplished.
Yeah, I agree. So the next one that also came out the same year is actually a trio of movies that were all like 3D films, which showed that 3D wasn't really reliable at the time. And also it was examples of how Disney got too big. They started colliding with each other and cannibalizing themselves with their movies because they had, too many, film studios they owned at the time, and they were colliding with each other. And the third one was the BFG. This was directed by Steven Spielberg, and it was based on a book that was by Roald Dahl.
A Roald Dahl, you mean?
Yeah, that guy, yeah. Sorry I mispronounced that, but okay. Anyway, you're probably used to that by that point. So I think my problem with this movie is that it's just way too toothless to be a kids movie, or at least something that's like the old Disney movies from the past. Because even the old Disney movies from Walt Disney, whether you're talking about like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Pinocchio, so on and so forth, they had a little bit of a dark and edginess to them. And I think the problem with this one is that it played it way too safe, and it was just not very good. Kind of a waste of time. So I would give the BFG a D+. And no, I'm not talking about the BFG from the Doom video games.
Interesting. Yeah, this is one actually I'll probably deviate a little bit. I saw it with my mother a few years ago, and because I remember us reading it when I was a kid. And so we saw it, and I was kind of expecting, like Tyler, just, relative dreck and, it being uninspired garbage. And while there were definitely those elements, I think that it was fine. It had a, sort of cute narrative, and I agree with the toothlessness. Like, I think the original BFG was still pretty soft, but this even managed to soften that a little bit. But I did end up kind of liking the casting choice for the giant, and I recall kind of just like finding it as enjoyable, kids entertainment with family. So I would probably put it more in a C category, maybe like a C plus for me.
Okay. So the next one is a movie that I think is one of the all-time worst Disney movies I've seen, animated or live action, and that is A Wrinkle in Time. So Wrinkle in Time was directed by Ava DuVernay, who is an activist filmmaker, and also later you had activist film directors, like, I remember his name, the guy who directed the Haunted Mansion movie from 2023 that bombed the box office. Mm-hmm. And then also from Marvel Studios, you had, I don't remember her name, but I think she might have been also an activist film director, directed the Marvels. All these movies bombed the box office, so maybe they learned their lesson and not hire the activist types to direct their movies. But my big issue with The Wrinkle in Time, not including really the director, is the fact that it should be called a waste of time, because this movie felt like an AI wrote it. Everything from the way it's written to the relationships with the characters feel very artificial. And just everything about it, story-wise, it does feel like an AI wrote the story, and how the pacing is how it's spaced out and everything, how it's structured. Like, I'm not saying that I've read the book Wrinkle in Time or seen the 2000s movie that was a TV movie, but the thing is that this whole movie was just flat out bad. It was just a snooze fest from beginning to end. There's really nothing worth watching about this movie or remembering about it. So yeah, it's just a flat out bad movie, which I can't emphasize enough about it. So I would give this an F.
Wow. Yeah, this is one I haven't seen. I have seen the original 2000s like made-for-TV movie, and I actually recall kind of liking that a bit. This is one that I do recall reading with my family, because my mom's an English teacher, and she really likes these types of books. And of course, this is a classic case of the book is better than the movie that's been made. But this version, I recall just seeing advertisements for, seeing casting choices and like directions it was clearly going that were very toothless, and I was not interested in it. I think Chris Pine was in it as the dad, but there was a very much more... It was so feminized, and I don't mean that in a necessarily political sense, as Tyler made, but just like they changed up the story in certain ways so heavy-handedly that it just felt like what we were going to get was for babies. And I could be wrong about that. I may give it a chance at some point, but it's bad when I was looking back fondly at a made-for-TV version of the multi-million-dollar Hollywood production. So ultimately, if this is your cup of tea, by all means, but I have not given it a chance yet, and I'm not sure when I will.
Yeah, this movie lost at least $100 million as one of the biggest failures, at least the late 2010s. So moving on from that is the Nutcracker in the Four Realms. Now this one is definitely a Christmas movie, but part of the reason why it failed, similar to Hocus Pocus, is that it was a Christmas movie released early on, long before Christmas. It was actually released close to Halloween, like a few days after Halloween. And yeah, they decided to give the releases to like Ralph Breaks the Internet and also Mary Poppins Returns for like Thanksgiving and Christmas time. So it didn't stand that much of a chance. And this one, I think, is very much a mixed bag movie. I like the attention to detail with the sets. They relied a lot on trying to make it realistic. There are definitely computer effects in this movie, but they tried as realistic as possible. I like the various music nods to Tchaikovsky's ballet music for the Nutcracker. And also, of course, I like Mackenzie Foy in this movie as the lead of it, at least what she had to do for this movie, being the first time leading a mainstream Hollywood movie. In fact, there are moments where you can tell they reshot this movie at times, because there was moments, if you pay attention to her face, she's more mature looking in certain moments towards the second half of the movie. Like, she was like 15 and 16 when they originally shot it, but then she was like 17 when they called back for reshoots. And Joe Johnston directed the reshoots because the original director of this movie wasn't available to do the reshoots. And this was the first live-action Disney movie since Midnight Madness where two directors directed a live-action Disney movie. But yeah, I do feel like Keira Knightley was kind of annoying with her Sugar Plum Fairy voice, and she does become a full Joel Schumacher level Batman villain when it's revealed she's like the twist villain, which I really do not like that whole surprise villain cliche we see in Disney movies and that started in the 2010s. I think we might be seeing that still in the 2020s. But yeah, this one removed the romantic aspect because the Nutcracker and the main character do fall in love in the story, but they made it more about girl power. There's a moment where the main character starts pulling off some mild martial art moves against these, toy soldiers, which it was never established. Like, I know the actress playing her, she does have a black belt in martial arts, but just because the person playing them knows martial arts doesn't mean the character should be able to pull off these martial arts. Like, imagine if I'm playing a character in a movie and it's not established that I know martial arts whatsoever, but in the third act I pull off some Shaolin monk level kung fu out of nowhere and it's never explained. That's just bad writing right there. But yeah, this one I'm just conflicted by because I like the lead of the movie. I also like the visual aspects of it. Remind me of Bram Stoker's Dracula, like some of the nods to Fantasia that it had. But yeah, I just feel like it's held back because it's very generic story-wise, very cliched in various aspects, and especially, Keira Knightley's lead. And part of the reason why it failed was that she was saying that she banned certain Disney movies from her daughter because they didn't align with her feminist views. Because she said, like, Cinderella's banned and Little Mermaid's banned because, don't give your voice up for a man, don't, wait for a rich guy to rescue you. And she said on the Ellen Show in another interview as well. But yeah, this one was just painfully mid for me, in my opinion. And it's one that I like the soundtrack to it, and I like some aspects of it. It reminds me of Christmas time. It got me into the Nutcracker soundtrack by Travasky, which is a positive thing about this movie. So on an H1 scale, I would give the Nutcracker and the Four Realms a C-.
Interesting. Yeah, this is one that I have not seen. We actually both know someone that worked behind the scenes a little bit on the film and attended the premiere, which is a pretty, fun fact, and congrats to her, Sierra, shout out. But, yeah, this is one I have not had the chance to see yet. I really should because of, the people we know behind it, but it definitely struck me as basically just another attempt at kind of the Alice in Wonderland stuff that to me didn't work very well. So I have not had a lot of interest, but I'm not surprised that it kind of looked like a passable middle brow family movie, and it kind of sounds like from Tyler's assessment it basically was. So
yeah, I think in retrospect, one way to really fix this movie easily is that they should have gotten more of a connection to Christmas time, which the movie is of course connected to. And I think the best way they could have fixed it with reshoots was that they should have made more of an emotional through line with Clara and her father, because they both lost someone they loved. With Clara, it's her mom, and with, of course, that being her father's wife. And I felt like if they would have emphasized that a bit more, of that aspect, emotional through line, it would have been a better story, because thematically there's really nothing really character-wise grown in that aspect, where it's just a character does this thing and that thing, and there's not really any personal growth, or at least that feels natural or makes any sense, or relates that much to the holiday of Christmas overall. But I gotta say that, yeah, the lead actress has definitely been much better in movies than this one, especially Interstellar, which she gave her best performance in my opinion. Alright, so the final movie to cover is the only live-action Disney remake that I cover in the book, and that is Dumbo. So Dumbo really go to show that, do we really need a live-action Disney remake for every animated movie by Disney? Because Dumbo cost about $170 million to make, and there's no way a simple story like this should even cost that close to that much to make. I think Tim Burton did fine. I liked the cast members of it, but like the animated Dumbo, I was never really a fan of it, and this one's just painfully mid for me, so I give it a C grade.
Interesting. Yeah, I have not had a chance to see the live-action Dumbo movie. I probably will at some point, just because I did really like the animated movie. It had a lot of elements that are both nostalgic to me as a child, and then also like the Jim Crows, that were like, I'm sure cut from the film, but kind of helped teach Dumbo to fly. That I'm curious how they address that aspect, and probably nowhere near as effective or fun, but for reasons of cultural sensitivity and stuff. But I really did enjoy the animated version, and I'm curious about this one. I don't expect a lot from most of these live action Disney films, because the only one remake wise that I have appreciated, and I don't recall if we've talked about this on another list yet or not, but The Jungle Book was the only one that I thought they hit the nail pretty well on the head for like a live action attempt at that. But the rest have had very little interest and looked pretty like cheap cash grabs to me. So I feel you on that.
Okay, I see that. Personally, I think Cinderella was the best live-action Disney remake. So those are my basic thoughts, and well, Steven's thoughts on the various movies I cover in my new book, Disney's live-action movie bombs, 1979-2019. Anyway, check it out and enjoy. So anyway, this is Tyler from Anchor Reviews.
And Steven, a.k.a. The Big Steve, on YouTube and Instagram.
And I hope you enjoyed this video. And anyway, check it out and enjoy the book, as well as my other book, 100 Years of Universal Monster Movies.
In stores now.
Yeah. Please like and subscribe.